We'll briefly describe what is an experiment and how we'll conduct one. So the first thing we want to form is based on our choice of gardening or composting or Adobe, is we want to form some sort of hypothesis based on our research. So we'll use the example of, does an increased temperature decrease the life cycle of yeast in bread? So if you know anything about yeast, it basically helps raise the bread and make it nice and fluffy as opposed to just a big sticky pile of dough. So let's just say, well, now that we've formed our hypothesis, we've got to think about what we're going to measure. So let's just suppose in this case that we're going to measure time, and we'll measure time in days. So that's what we're gonna measure, and specifically the units of what we're gonna measure. So we don't really need a device to measure that. We can just count the number of days. And output in this case maybe would be the percentage of active yeast remaining. That may be a little difficult to measure unless you have some sort of specific scientific tools, but let's just suppose that we do. So now what we're going to do is, well, we're going to try to hold things constant. In other words, now we've got this variable of temperature that we're trying to test on these variables. So we're going to form two groups. We're going to form a control group, which a control group is where you don't change anything. You keep things constant. So in normal conditions, you'd probably have something at room temperature. So 78 degrees Fahrenheit would be about the control group, or the normal temperature for yeast and bread. So now we want to test the experimental group. The experimental group is going to be the one where we're actually going to alter one thing. So the experimental group, let's just say that the only thing we do differently there is we keep this under conditions of 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So maybe we put it in an oven. And then as time passes, so again, this might seem ridiculous, but we're going to track the day, comma, the actual percentage of yeast remaining, and here we'll do the same thing, the day and the percentage of yeast still alive. And pretty soon we'll have a bunch of ordered pairs for both the control group and experimental group, and then we can create two separate graphs. You know, one may look like this, one maybe looks like this, who knows, but I'll have one for the control group and the experimental group, at which point in the future these things will be able to be compared. Now, what has to go into this? Here we're keeping the temperature at room temperature, and here we're keeping the temperature at 150 degrees. So suppose here are your two boxes that are going to contain your bread. One is room temperature, here's your control, here's your experimental group, and now you're taking collecting data on these things. But suppose that this box that this one is in is actually a different material. So maybe this is made out of metal, and this box that's doing the 150 degrees Fahrenheit is some other type of metal. Who knows? I'm just kind of making this up as I go. But the metal and the other metal, well, now how many variables do you actually have? Well, you have a control group, which you're saying is identical to the experimental group, except that one thing is different, i.e. the temperatures. But now, in your actual experimental process, you have incorporated another factor, and the factor being the material in which the bread is being stored. So if you observe different results, how do you know for sure? Now, you might be convinced, you might think that it's due to the temperature, but how can you be absolutely sure that there wasn't some sort of interaction between the type of material and the temperature, or maybe it was just the material and the temperature had no effect, or maybe it was just the temperature and the material had no effect. So you don't really know for sure. So everything has to be exactly the same. Exactly the same. And you're only manipulating one thing. Only manipulating one factor, the thing that you're trying to test to see if it has any effect on your results. So that's very important when you design your experiment, that you have identical conditions in your control group and your experimental group. The one that the experimental group is what you want to test. They have to be identical. The only difference can be the thing that you're actually manipulating.